Hello everyone. For the last type of diagram in chapter 6.2, we're going to take a look at a very peculiar one. First of all, if you're having pie charts like this, right? So we have primary, secondary and tertiary, and you'll see that over the years we always have three components. And it turns out that if we have a topic that has three components, we can now make a new type of diagram. And this diagram, I think, is a lot less known than the ones that we have taken a look at previously in chapter 6.2. So remember, this can only be done if you have three components, right? Like this. And this kind of diagram is called a so-called ternary diagram, of een driehoeksdiagram in het Nederlands. Misschien logischer aangezien het eruit ziet als een driehoek, zoals je hier rechts kan zien. We're going to take a look at how we can place points on this, you could say grid, right? And if we have a point, how can we determine the values that correspond with that point? First of all, this ternary diagram corresponds with this pie chart right here, right? So what they have done is they set up an isometric grid of triangles, and they're going to place points inside this triangle that corresponds with one, now not even with one, with all three of the sides. So let's take a look. They've placed a point right here, and let's say 1900. So that means this point corresponds with this pie chart of 1900. How should you read this diagram right now? Well, you're always going to follow the so-called green arrows that are on the outside of the triangle, right? So you draw parallel to the green arrows. So if we have right here, we're going to follow this primary green arrow. If we follow that, we'll stop right here on 20, right? But the 20 is on the secondary axis. So that means that the secondary sector right here should be 20. That's correct, right? If we follow the secondary arrow, we end up on the tertiary axis. And that's somewhere between 40 and 60. And you see in the middle there should be 50. So this indeed corresponds with 45. That's correct. And if we follow the tertiary arrow, follow it all the way through the primary axis, and there it ends on 35, right? Because here is 30, so here should be 35. And also that corresponds with the pie chart right here. So remember, always follow the green arrows, so you know which value corresponds with the points. But remember, if I follow the primary arrow, I end up on the secondary axis. So it doesn't mean if I follow the primary arrow that this also is my value for the primary in this case. No, it's the secondary. That's something that could go wrong very easily. So let's take a look. Here they've done the same for 1960 and 2000. And if you're going to take a look, first at 1960, if we follow primary, we end up on 30 on the secondary. That's correct. If we follow secondary, we end up on 60 on the tertiary. That's correct also. And if we follow the last arrow tertiary to primary, it ends up in 10. So this point indeed corresponds with 1960. And on this point, which is very close to the tertiary axis, if we follow the first arrow from the primary, we end up on the secondary, which is 20, which is correct. Follow the arrow from secondary to tertiary, we end up somewhere between 60 and 80, right? And it should be 75. And if we end with this arrow, the tertiary on the primary, that ends with 5. And as you can see, in the end, always all percentages add up to 100%, right? Because I can't have less than 100%. Only with, in this case, tertiary diagrams, you know that there are always three components that together should add up to this so-called 100%. And I think there are two kinds of exercises that you should do with this one. One is knowing how to read values, right? So they give you points, and then afterwards you should say, well, if this is the point, then these are the values that corresponds with, in this case, 1960 or 2000, etc. But the other thing that you should be able to do is drawing the points after you have given for let's say a circle diagram, or a pie chart I mean. If you have a pie chart, then you should be able to place the points inside this tertiary diagram for yourself. So please practice with those exercises.